Mr. Speaker, there is zero evidence to justify the many changes found in the Liberals' firearms legislation proposed as Bill C-71. They're trying to fix a problem that doesn't exist. In fact, they are only further burdening law-abiding firearms owners rather than actually going after people who commit crimes. I, for one, would prefer that our law enforcement agencies and the Government of Canada spend their time, energy and resources on cracking down on gangs and criminals. To step back for a moment, law-abiding firearms owners do not trust this Liberal government. They don't believe that the changes found in C-71 will actually make our streets safer or put criminals behind bars. I want to focus my comments on two aspects of this legislation that are deeply flawed and why I believe this legislation must be defeated. In the last Parliament, our previous Conservative government passed the Common Sense Firearms Licensing Act. Found in that legislation was the sensible change of introducing an automatic authorization to transport firearms. This meant that individuals were no longer required to contact the RCMP for certain routine and lawful activities as it became a condition of a restricted PAL holder's license. This was a common-sense change, as why would a law-abiding licensed owner need to notify the RCMP to tell them they were taking their licensed firearm to a firing range? By adding the authorization to transport their firearm as part of their license, it freed up valuable RCMP resources. And it must be said, if the firearms owner did not follow the conditions as part of their license, they would have it revoked. A very severe punishment, Mr. Speaker. If the government is going to give someone the right to own a firearm, to shoot a firearm, to store a firearm, to compete with a firearm, why wouldn't we give them the automatic right to transport a firearm? Now, found in this legislation, the Liberals are reverting back to the old ways of not trusting responsible, law-abiding Canadians to automatically transfer their firearms. Why? Well, it's because they think it suits their political needs. And there is ample evidence to back that statement. Before the last election, the Liberal Party went as far as scaring the public by suggesting that an automatic authorization to transport firearms was going to make Canada less safe. During question period on November 26, 2014, the now leader of the Liberals said the right to have an automatic authorization to transfer a firearm would, quote, allow handguns and assault weapons to be freely transported in a trunk anywhere within a province, even left parked outside a Canadian Tire or local hockey arena, end quote. This was and remains a very erroneous statement. The law is quite clear that when it says that you are only allowed to transport prohibited or restricted firearms, quote, between two or more specific places for any good and sufficient reason, end quote. And if we dig even further into the regulations, it says that they must transport their firearms by, quote, reasonably direct, end quote, routes. While the Liberals are entitled to their opinions, they are not entitled to ignore the facts. They cannot just purport something to be true, while the law says something completely different. For those thinking that calling up the RCMP every time you want to get authorization to transport a firearm isn't that big a deal, let me put on the record the amount of times the RCMP previously had to go through this process. Since 2008, the RCMP issued 992,139 authorizations. It's almost 1 million phone calls, Mr. Speaker. For argument's sake, let's just say that it takes about an average of 8 minutes to get this process done. That's 132,285 hours of that the RCMP could have used on investigating crimes and patrolling our streets and highways. Now that we've established the inordinate amount of time this process takes, with little evidence it actually enhances public safety, let's dig further into the numbers. If we really think that the RCMP issuing authorization to transport firearms is doing something to keep our streets safe, people might want to know that over the past 7 years, out of close to 1 million authorizations issued, only 17 have been refused. This would indicate that it is really only a fruitless endeavour that really doesn't accomplish a whole lot. And with all that in mind, what evidence did the Liberals put forward for why we have to revert back to the old ways? Nothing, Mr. Speaker. When the Hells Angels start calling the RCMP to let them know when they are transferring their firearms, I might change my tune on this matter. But until criminals decide to start applying for firearms licenses, I think we should call a spade and admit that seeking an authorization to transfer a firearm does nothing to enhance the safety of Canadians. The second part of this deeply flawed legislation is the removal of any oversight of the classification of firearms. For years, there was no recourse or appeal process if a firearm was not correctly classified. That meant that the individuals who are in charge of this process could make millions of dollars worth of property worthless with the stroke of a pen. While I'm not a hunter or a sport shooter, I can understand their frustration when a firearm they have owned for years, or in some cases even decades, is suddenly prohibited. No one in this House is suggesting that classifying firearms should not be taking place. All we are asking for is an appeal process, or at the very least, a very clear understanding of the regulations that determine the classification of a firearm. I want to be very clear. Firearms should not receive a classification based on its appearance. Their classification should solely be based on its form and function. If the Liberals wanted to provide greater clarity on the clarification of firearms, they would have legislated the firearms reference table into law. The firearms reference table information is used during the process of firearms identification, classification, tracing, importation, and registration. Right now, the public has no ability to find out what is contained in the firearms reference table or the justification of why a firearm was classified. I want to salute Matthew Hipwell, a former RCMP officer who served for 17 years, bringing this issue to the Public Safety Committee during their study on C-71. It was Matthew who brought to the committee's attention that Murray Smith of the RCMP said, and I quote, "The firearms reference table has no standing in law. It's simply the viewpoint of the firearms program on classification and description of any particular item," end quote. This has led to all sorts of problems, as the definition to determine a classification are neither clearly nor legally defined. They are open to different interpretation and opinion. For example, the use of the word variant. There is no legal definition of variant. Another challenge to correctly classify a firearm is the definition readily and easily when determining if it can be reconfigured. If the firearms reference table has no standing in law, why are the Liberals completely gutting the ability of Cabinet, made up of elected representatives, to overturn a wrongful classification? This was the only possible way to correct a wrongful classification. Now, if someone wants to challenge the classification of a firearm, they actually have to get arrested. That's the most irresponsible and undemocratic element of this legislation. Just think for a moment, if you are a firearms owner, you literally have to go out and get arrested in order to challenge the reclassification of a firearm that you may have owned for decades. If this Liberal legislation has accomplished one thing, it has shown the need to establish clearly defined definitions of the criteria used to classify firearms. Mr. Speaker, it also must be said that after reviewing all the expert witness testimony, not a single recommendation or amendment was accepted that was put forward by a firearms expert. I cannot and will never support a piece of legislation that only goes after law-abiding firearms owners. There is little to nothing contained in this legislation that will crack down on criminals. Once again, the Liberals think that duck hunters and sharpshooters, sport shooters, are the problem. While they blindly pass this legislation, I will oppose it with every step of the way. I will always stand up for law-abiding firearms owners and advocate for legislation that will actually make our streets and communities safer. Bill C-71 fails in this effort.